Okay, we're going to get started. Good morning, everybody, both here live in the office and online in the virtual session. Good morning. This is our wet season rainfall outlook for the Hawaiian Islands for the 2023-2024 wet season. What I'll do is I'll get started by summarizing the dry season, which ended at the end of September. The dry season runs from May through September of every year. And statewide, most locations had near to below average rainfall totals for the dry season. Actually, if you recall, the last wet season kind of ran into the first overtime period. We had some rain events during May, and so the dry season for this year actually started a little bit late, but it flipped around pretty quickly in June, and by mid-June already, we were seeing first stage of drought in the east half of the state. And from that point on, drought intensified and spread so that we had the D2 conditions, which is the severe drought category on the U.S. drought monitor map, starting to spring up. And then all four counties had at least D2 conditions, severe drought at the end of the dry season. In some places, especially in Maui County and on the Big Island, we actually had drought reach the extreme category, which is D3 on the U.S. drought monitor map. And this was in the leeward portion of Maui, the island of Maui, and small sections on the Big Island, namely near Upolu Point and South Point on the Big Island. The worst impacts were actually affecting the ag sector, and of course, as everybody knows, devastating wildfires on Maui and also on the Big Island, leeward side of the Big Island. Looking at the numbers, we actually ended up with the 8th driest dry season in the last 30 years. For context, the driest dry season was in 2010, and the wettest dry season was back in 2015. If you recall, that was also the record-breaking year for tropical cyclone activity, and that of course ended up providing quite a bit of rainfall to the state of Hawaii. And that dry season, the wet conditions during that dry season extended well into the wet season 2015. So what are we looking at for the wet season, which started in October 1st and runs through the end of April? We're looking at, right now we're in El Nino conditions. The NOAA's Climate Prediction Center has an El Nino advisory in effect, and the El Nino event developed during the spring and then intensified during the summer months, and it's of course ongoing and still becoming stronger. Usually El Nino events peak during the northern hemispheres of the winter season, so we still have some way to go. The CPC, the Climate Prediction Center, is forecasting this event this El Nino to become a strong event, with a 3 in 10 chance of it becoming what they call historically strong, so meaning something comparable to the 1997-1998 strong El Nino or the 2015-2016 strong El Nino. For the rainfall forecast, the consensus of the climate models is forecasting large-scale, drier than average conditions throughout the entire wet season. And this is a bit different from what you would normally expect from during El Nino. Normally, with a strong El Nino drought takes hold in mid-December at some point and then extends into February and March timeframe. But this time around, we're in it. We've already started it. Normally, with an El Nino year, you can have the fall months can be a bit wet, and then the El Nino drought sets in as I mentioned, during December. But this time we've started it. We've been in it during the dry season, and we haven't stopped. And so conditions are just expected to get worse. And we're seeing a really strong signal in our climate models that we're going to be in a significant drought. So what that means is, we're already seeing significant or widespread drought that is expected to increase even more. So especially by the end of February, we're looking at statewide or widespread, at least moderate drought conditions, which is the D1 category. And embedded within that, we're going to see, many areas with D2 to D4 conditions, which is severe drought to exceptional drought in various portions of the state. What we're looking at is even the potential for having more than 40% of the state to be in at least D2 conditions. Right now, we're at around 16% of the state is D2 or D3, but I'm expecting to intensify quite a bit more, so that by the end of February, again, potentially more than 40%. And this drought, we're looking at extending well into next year and into even the next dry season, 2024 dry season. So that's what our guidance is pointing to right now. In terms of impacts, the sectors that are sensitive to short-term rainfall deficits, they're going to have the most severe drought impacts. So you're talking about non-irrigated agriculture, non-irrigated crops and pastures are going to have severe impacts. I mean, we're already seeing very significant impacts, but that's expected to increase and expand as we go along over the next several months. For water supply, anybody who's on water catchment, you may already be seeing impacts that's expected to worsen, and you may have periods where you might have some mild relief, right? Some rain events that come through, but overall we're going to be in significant rainfall deficits, and they'll just expand during the coming months. The brush fires, normally the wet season is when you see some rainfall relief, and the vegetation starts to restore, and that's not expected to happen right now. So we're looking at the potential for out of season brush fires, brush fire ignitions, and usually, especially during the winter months with El Nino, our winds tend to get light, and so that would mitigate red flag warnings. But as we get later into the wet season, more toward March, April timeframe, there's a potential for, as trades start to try and come back, and there's a chance you might have the winds may push conditions into red flag territory. So looking back in 2009-2010 drought, that El Nino, we had some red flag events during March and April. So that's something that may potentially occur. Other impacts, surfers might be excited about El Nino events, especially the strong El Nino like we may be seeing. And usually in January and February, we have quite a bit of large surf events for the North Shore. And so maybe this year might see a second consecutive year of where the Eddy can be held, but we'll see. But usually the North Shore surf will peak in January, so we'll have multiple days with high surf advisory, high surf warning conditions out there. And that's all I have in terms of the rainfall outlook. One thing I do want to remind folks, though, is that even though we have a drought in effect or drought conditions out there in terms of the overall climate, you still can have a stray heavy rain event come through. And in fact, we may see some heavy rain next week, early part of next week. That's something that we're watching for really close, but overall conditions are expected to be drier than average over the next several months. And so, if we do have a heavy rain event come up, again, if you're out there, don't attempt to drive across flooded roads or hike across swollen streams, and just be aware of the conditions out there and be safe as always. That's all I have. On the media advisory, there's some links to more preparedness information and climate information, and there's also at the bottom there's some links to the map that you see on the screen here. And there are two versions. One's going to be for the rainfall total for the dry season, and the other one's for the percent of average. So I'll stop and I'll take any questions you may have, both live here in the room and online.
You mentioned a stronger El Nino. How strong are we talking?
Right now, most of the guidance is kind of favoring getting into what they call the strong category, but not quite as strong as 97, 98 or 2015, 2016. But they did say 3 in 10 chance of the event getting into that level. But right now, the majority is above the strong threshold, but not quite getting into what they call historically, what term to use, historically strong.
And what's the differentiation if it crosses over that threshold into a strong or historically strong?
I mean, it's just more of an extreme event. I mean, when we see a strong, I mean, it's not like we're going to see drastically different impacts. I mean, the last time we had, in 2015, 2016, that hurricane season was the record-breaking hurricane season. And so far, we haven't seen that. So the El Nino is still in the process of still kind of intensifying, slowly getting stronger, but we'll see where that goes. But in terms of drought conditions, this the 2016 drought, even though it was a strong El Nino, it wasn't as bad as the 98 strong El Nino, and wasn't as bad as the 2009, 2010 was a moderate to strong El Nino, not as strong as this one, but the drought was a lot worse. And we had other conditions at play. For instance, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. There's all these other cycles that go on, and so that one was really bad, that drought. And in fact, there's some indications that this one is kind of shaping up to be more similar to the 2010 drought.
It doesn't the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, doesn't that go about every 10 years or so?
Or longer, yeah, multi-decades, yeah. So right now it's in the cold phase, right? Interesting.
Hey, just so we're on the same page, the months that are considered the wet season, if you could reiterate that, please.
Yeah, it's October through April is the wet season, and normally we see, on average, we see our first cold front passage during October. We kind of get into more of that winter type, weather pattern. We already had one very early October, and it just made it past Hawaii. So counting that.
Okay.
Yeah, but typically around just after mid-October is the average for our first cold front passage.
Drier than normal conditions, is that due to the fact that we're not potentially going to see as many upper level lows, corner lows, cold fronts, or is it the lack of trade showers, or is it both?
Both, actually, and thanks for that question. You make a good point. Part of what I should have mentioned too is that we may not see as many, heavy rain systems. So like you mentioned, upper lows or fronts, the pattern that sets up, especially from mid-December on through February, is one where the high pressure ridge kind of settles in either over the state or nearby, just to the north, or maybe even south of the main Hawaiian Islands. And so we get very stable, and the storm tracks are to the north of the Hawaiian Islands. The jet stream becomes what we call zonal, very east-west, very strong. And so these systems go really fast across the North Pacific. And what that means is the California coast, especially Southern Cal, they get a lot of rainfall events because all of the storm tracks go right into them. Atmospheric rivers, drawing a blank, the AR, what they call AR events, atmospheric rivers. So they see a lot of those, but what that means for us is that we miss on a lot of those storms.
So basically, when you mention a potential for increased high surf events in January, February, right?
Yeah.
So that means basically there is an assumption that those storms will be very active to the north.
Yeah, well, to the
the
north.
storm track doesn't dip down to the south. So we get the surf minus the rain.
Yeah, it becomes, with the jet becoming very energetic, you can have strong low pressure systems, but they're all in the northern Pacific. And you point the wave fetch toward us and we get the surf. It's indirect weather event.
Okay.
The surf comes to us, but in terms of direct weather, fronts just don't reach us.
Okay.
We might see a front, but it's weak in the tail end. Yeah, but usually we get just high pressure over us, light winds, cool nights, warm day, sunny days, afternoon cloudiness, that type of thing, very little rain, day after day after day.
Sounds good, thank you.
All right, we have a question online from John Burnett. John, if you're available, please ask your question.
Hey, Kevin, how you doing? I have a couple of quick questions. One, with the El Nino, if that El Nino continues and we have the drought, we have the hotter than normal equatorial waters in the Pacific, does that portend for possible, so far we haven't seen much as far as a hurricane season, but does this portend for possibly an extension of that hurricane season? Maybe some out of season storms coming our way?
Yes, that's a good question. So one of the hallmarks of El Nino for the Hawaiian Islands is that we do have the potential for an extension of the hurricane season. If you just have a couple of reminders, Hurricane Eva was an El Nino year. That was in late November. Super Typhoon Paka, it mainly affected Guam, but it generated in the central North Pacific. That was a December system. And back in the 2015 season, the record-breaking season, we actually had some systems we had a December system and we had one even in January. So yes, it means that we could see an extension of the hurricane season. So we, in this type of climate pattern, we encourage folks not to let their guard down, because of the extension of the tropical cyclone season.
The other question, the Kona Coffee Belt, the leeward upslope on the Big Island experiences its dry season when the rest of the state is getting the wet season. Does this portend for a drier than normal dry season for them?
Yes, when El Nino drought sets up, it's a statewide drought. That's one thing. That's one of the hallmarks of an El Nino, especially with a moderate to strong event. And so, if you recall back when I talked about the 2010 drought, one of the impacts from the 2010 drought was that the Kona side didn't get the rain, and into their growing season, into the wet season in the summer, we still stayed dry. And so that's when Kona coffee production was impacted, and I had reports of Kona coffee trees dying from that. And so that was part of that whole significant drought, and one of the big impacts out of that. The Big Island was hit pretty hard from that drought.
Thanks, Kevin.
Kevin, you talked about drought conditions. Where are we right now, and how is that? How does that compare to, say, other years where we are right now?
Right now, the dry season was, so I was saying this number 8, 8th driest, and top 10, not the driest, but respectable. One thing that's significant though is that we're still dry. And October, our winds went light. We've been very dry. In fact, looking at I didn't check all of the sites, but Hilo Airport, Honolulu Airport, for instance, they're less than 20% right now of the October average. So our wet season hasn't started, essentially. We'll see what happens next week, but the way it looks, so far, it might affect the midsection of the state, but and the Hilo side might not have too much, but we'll see. It's so early, but we have some ground to make up already in October, and the long range projections show even November and December to be dry too. So, and then the El Nino drought takes hold, and we're dry all the way through next spring.
And I know, sorry, I didn't. You have any other questions?
No, after you.
I know you talked about the warmer waters down around the equator. Does that help shift? I know the storm track, they tend to get the tail ends of the front. Does that tend to shift that track more to the north whenever those warmer waters expand to the north?
Yeah, the whole impact from El Nino and that warming is that it shifts the whole atmospheric pattern. And so part of that anomalous warming causes a shift in the convection and all, where the jet sets up and all those things. So it's all part of the overall impacts, the set of impacts from El Nino.
You mentioned drought. We're all in this as a state together. With the storm track shifting farther north, Kauai being the most northern and western island, would it be safe to assume that impacts would be less for Kauai versus the Big Island, which is farther south and farthest east, and somewhere in the middle for Oahu and Maui?
I would say that yes. Short answer is yes. Kauai has the best chance of having fewer impacts, but they in previous events they've still seen drier than normal conditions. But you're right. I mean, fronts may come in, they may even reach Kauai, like the one at the beginning of this month, hit Kauai, went into the Kauai channel and then died. So we may see events hit Kauai, maybe Oahu, but lift right out, or not even get to Oahu, those types of things. Yeah, and when they do hit, they'll probably be pretty weak, I would say.
So we have a question online from Nina Wu. Can you talk about the potential risk for more brush fires into the wet season? Has this become an increasing trend over the years that brush fires happen year round and not just during the dry season?
I haven't looked at the data in terms of the long-term trend, but in terms of the increased risk during the dry season, yes, because normally, the wet season is when the vegetation will regrow, green up again, and so your fire risk lowers. In this case, we're not expected to see substantial improvement in the fuels, and the fuels will still be dry. And so that's why you have a higher chance of what we call out of season brush fires, because it's just going to stay dry. Normally, for instance, Diamond Head and Punch Bowl green up during the wet season. I wouldn't be surprised if Diamond Head stays brown the whole time. That's just the part of what you would expect during El Nino drought.
Yeah. Talk about, we're still in this extended dry season, but typically wintertime winds tend to pick up. So is there an increased fire risk because the rain's dry and we're going to have stronger winds come winter?
Actually, it depends on the climate pattern, of course. With El Nino, like I was mentioning, when the ridge sets up over us and we have a lot of light winds. So in the past, or at least in the last, I want to say 5 to 10 years, El Nino events have not had red flag warnings during the wet season. The only exception was I talked about 2010. And that was toward the tail end of the wet season. March and April, we had a string of red flag days. You would think that the 3 ingredients you need for red flag: low humidity, of course, dry conditions, and then the winds. And the drought would produce dry conditions, potential for lower humidity, but you're absent the winds, and you think just any particular wind event come in, and then you could have hit that threshold if it's strong enough. But again, only the 2010 event we saw a red flag, and we're looking at the others, 2015, 2016, we didn't see any red flag days. In the 2018, 2019 El Nino didn't have any red flag in there. In fact, we went through a pretty long period where we didn't have red flag conditions.
Do you remember what the set as to why that happened in the 2010, why we had red flag events?
I'd have to look back at what happened. It was not as strong as this one. It was a moderate to strong event. So it could be that trade winds tried to come in a lot, as they normally do during March and April. Trade winds start coming back. You're starting to transition out of that deep winter pattern, and so that you can have really strong trade winds during March, and possibly that's what happened.
Oh, so it wasn't like there was a system that, say, developed to the south of us that helped to boost our trades during our.
No.
You were saying about the warmer temperature in the equator. Does that mean a longer typhoon season for those in the Mariana Islands?
Yeah, it's similar to us. They have an extension of the tropical cyclone season. So I talked about Paka in '98. It formed near or southwest of Hawaii in our basin and went right across the date line and then intensified and directly impacted Guam. So yeah, they're just like us. They can have an extension of the tropical cyclone season.
And Kevin, you may have covered this too, came just a little bit late. Are we seeing any kind of trend as far as rainfall totals year to year? As far as just totals, are we seeing less rain each year, more rain, or just staying right about average?
I think long-term, UH has done some studies. They've looked at some, long-term decreases, but that's going back to like 1920, I think. But I'm not familiar with all the regional details on that. I do know that places like Mount Waialeale, one of the wettest spots in the state, I look at that data quite a bit. Looking at a running 30-year average, that average has steadily decreased over many years now. So at one point, the 30-year average was over 400 inches, and now they're about 385, something like that. Some years you have a little uptick, it goes up and down, but the overall trend is definitely down. Gradually, slowly but steadily going lower.
Would it be safe to assume that that probably correlates to other areas in Hawaii or the state?
I would say so, yeah. Kukui is another, West Maui, they've been seeing a decrease, but I don't have as long and good a record for that rain gauge. Any others on that? Okay, if no other questions, thank you for attending and tuning in online. Again, you should have received the media advisory by email. It's going to be posted. It's probably on our top news section of our webpage, weather.gov/Hawaii. So you can check that out, or you can always email me or call me if you have any other questions. But if not, thanks for tuning in, and stay safe and save water. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.